Margaret Thompson pulled her worn leather satchel closer to her chest as she stepped off the military transport truck. The dust from the Afghan desert swirled around her sensible black shoes, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. At 52, she had grown accustomed to being the oldest person in most rooms, but, here at Forward Operating Base Warrior, she felt ancient among the young soldiers bustling around her. Colonel James Mitchell stood waiting near the makeshift headquarters, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. He had been commanding this remote outpost for 18 months, and the last thing he needed was some civilian getting in his way. The Pentagon had sent word that a medical specialist would be arriving, but when he saw the middle-aged woman with graying hair and thick glasses climbing down from the truck, his heart sank. "You must be the doctor they sent," Mitchell said, his tone barely concealing his disappointment. He had been expecting someone younger, someone with military experience, someone who looked like they could handle the harsh conditions of a combat zone. Margaret extended her hand with a firm grip. "Dr. Margaret Thompson, infectious disease specialist. I understand you have a situation here that requires immediate attention." The colonel glanced around nervously. For the past 3 weeks, his soldiers had been falling ill with mysterious symptoms. It started with just a few cases of severe fever and weakness, but now nearly 30% of his unit was affected. The military doctors had run every test they could think of, but nothing showed up. The sick soldiers were getting worse, and morale was plummeting. "Look, Dr. Thompson," Mitchell said, lowering his voice. "I appreciate the Pentagon sending help, but I was hoping for someone with more battlefield experience. This isn't exactly a hospital setting." Margaret had heard variations of this speech countless times throughout her career. She had spent the last 25 years dealing with disease outbreaks in some of the world's most challenging environments. From the Ebola crisis in West Africa to SARS in Hong Kong, she had seen things that would give most people nightmares. But she had learned long ago that her unassuming appearance often worked in her favor. "I understand your concerns, Colonel. Why don't you show me to the patients so I can assess the situation?" Mitchell led her through the base, pointing out various facilities along the way. The FOB was a collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and razor wire, all designed for function over comfort. Soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, but Margaret noticed the underlying tension in their movements. Fear had a way of spreading faster than any disease. The medical tent was larger than she had expected, with 24 beds arranged in neat rows. Most were occupied by soldiers in various states of illness. Some lay motionless with high fevers, while others sat up weakly, picking at military rations they couldn't keep down. The smell of antiseptic mixed with human suffering created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, the base's head medic, approached them with a clipboard full of charts. "Dr. Thompson? Thank God you're here. We've been dealing with this for weeks, and, honestly, we're at our wits' end." Margaret began her examination of the patients, moving methodically from bed to bed. She checked temperatures, examined throats, felt for swollen lymph nodes, and asked detailed questions about symptoms. The soldiers, initially wary of the civilian doctor, gradually opened up to her gentle but thorough approach. "When did your symptoms first appear?" she asked Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Ohio who looked even younger lying in the hospital bed. "About 5 days ago, ma'am. Started with a headache, then the fever hit like a truck. Been throwing up everything I try to eat." Margaret made notes in her leather journal, a habit she had developed over decades of fieldwork. The symptoms were consistent across all patients: sudden onset of high fever, severe headache, nausea, and extreme fatigue. What puzzled her was the pattern of infection. Military units were typically exposed to the same environmental factors, so infectious diseases usually spread in predictable ways. This outbreak seemed almost random. Colonel Mitchell watched from a distance as she worked. He had to admit that despite his initial skepticism, she moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her questions were precise, her examination technique thorough, and the soldiers seemed to trust her immediately. "What's your assessment so far?" he asked when she finally took a break. Margaret removed her glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. "The symptom pattern is unusual. It's clearly infectious, but the distribution doesn't match typical vector-borne diseases or contaminated food sources. I need to examine your water supply, food storage areas, and any recent changes to the base environment. Changes? What kind of changes? Anything unusual in the past month? New construction, different supply routes, unusual wildlife activity, changes in local population movements. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key. Over the next several hours, Margaret conducted a thorough investigation of the base. She tested water samples from multiple sources, examined food storage and preparation areas, and interviewed soldiers about their activities before falling ill. The colonel followed her around, initially skeptical but growing more impressed with her systematic approach. As evening approached, she requested access to the base's communication logs and supply records. Colonel Mitchell hesitated. "That's classified military information, Doctor. I'm not sure I can authorize civilian access to operational records." Margaret looked at him directly, her voice calm but firm. "Colonel, I need to see those records if you want me to solve this problem. Whatever is making your soldiers sick isn't respecting security clearances." Mitchell found himself in a difficult position. The Pentagon had given him orders to cooperate fully with the medical specialist, but operational security was ingrained in every aspect of military life. He made a decision that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "Captain Rodriguez will accompany you and review the sensitive information first. Anything relevant to the medical situation can be shared." As they worked through the evening, Margaret's investigation began to reveal some interesting patterns. 3 weeks earlier, the base had received a shipment of supplies from a new contractor. The timing coincided almost exactly with the first cases of illness. Additionally, several soldiers mentioned seeing unusual insects around the new storage containers. "What kind of insects?" Margaret asked. Sergeant Williams, who was feeling well enough to assist with the investigation, scratched his head. "Hard to describe, ma'am. Looked like really big mosquitoes, but different somehow. They seemed to be attracted to the new containers." Margaret felt the familiar tingle of discovery that had driven her career for decades. She requested permission to examine the storage area after dark, when the insects would be most active. Colonel Mitchell agreed, though he insisted on providing armed escort. The storage area was located on the perimeter of the base, a collection of metal containers surrounded by floodlights. As they approached with flashlights, Margaret immediately noticed the unusual flying insects around the newer containers. They were indeed larger than typical mosquitoes, with distinctive markings she didn't recognize. "I need to collect some specimens," she told the colonel. "And I need to examine the contents of these containers very carefully." Using techniques learned from years of field research, Margaret carefully captured several insects and sealed them in collection vials. The containers themselves appeared normal from the outside, but when they opened one to inspect the contents, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The military supplies were packed in biodegradable packing material that was still damp with condensation. The material had an unusual smell, slightly sweet and organic. More importantly, it was teeming with insect larvae. "Colonel, I think we may have found our answer. These insects aren't native to this region. They came in with your supplies, and they're carrying something that's making your soldiers sick." Mitchell stared at the infested packing material. "How is that possible? All supplies go through inspection. The inspection process is designed to detect weapons and contraband, not exotic insects. These larvae probably look like harmless organic material to a standard security check." As they collected samples and sealed the affected containers, Margaret explained her preliminary theory. The insects were likely carrying a pathogen that was transmitted through their bites. The random pattern of infection made sense if soldiers were being bitten while working in or near the storage area during different shifts. "So what do we do now?" the colonel asked. "First, we need to get these samples to a proper laboratory for identification. Second, we need to treat the affected containers to eliminate the insect population. Third, we need to start treating the sick soldiers with broad-spectrum antibiotics while we wait for specific pathogen identification." Colonel Mitchell looked at the unassuming woman who had arrived that morning with skeptical eyes. In less than 12 hours, she had accomplished more than his entire medical team had managed in 3 weeks. He was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated Dr. Margaret Thompson.
What do you need from me to make this happen?
A secure communication line to the CDC in Atlanta, priority transport for these samples to the nearest military laboratory, and authorization to implement immediate containment protocols. As they walked back toward the base headquarters, Margaret continued outlining her plan. The soldiers needed to be isolated from the contaminated area, all personnel needed to be screened for insect bites, and a comprehensive decontamination of the storage area needed to begin immediately.
How long before we know for sure what we're dealing with? Mitchell asked.
If I'm right about the pathogen type, we should have preliminary identification within 48 hours.
Full treatment protocols within a week.
The colonel stopped walking and turned to face her. Dr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. When I saw you step off that truck this morning, I thought the Pentagon had sent me someone who wouldn't last a day out here. Margaret smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself since arriving. Colonel, I've been dealing with dangerous microorganisms longer than most of your soldiers have been alive.
The enemy I fight just happens to be too small to see without a microscope.
As they entered the communications center to contact the CDC, both Margaret and Colonel Mitchell knew that the real work was just beginning. Identifying the pathogen was only the first step in what could be a complex treatment and containment operation. But, for the first time in weeks, the colonel felt genuine hope that his soldiers would recover. Margaret spent the rest of the night coordinating with laboratories and medical experts across multiple time zones. Her reputation in the infectious disease community opened doors that might have remained closed to other civilian consultants. By morning, she had arranged for expedited testing and preliminary treatment protocols. The soldiers in the medical tent seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Word had spread quickly through the base that the civilian doctor had identified the source of the mysterious illness. Morale, which had been steadily declining for weeks, began to show signs of improvement. Captain Rodriguez approached Margaret as she finished her morning rounds.
Doctor, I wanted to thank you. We were starting to panic, thinking we were dealing with some kind of biological weapon or unknown virus.
Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones we never see coming, Margaret replied. But, once you understand what you're fighting, you can develop strategies to win.
Colonel Mitchell had spent the early morning hours implementing Margaret's containment recommendations.
The affected storage area was cordoned off, all personnel were being screened for insect bites, and decontamination procedures were underway. He found Margaret reviewing laboratory results that had begun arriving through secure channels. "What's the verdict?" he asked. Margaret looked up from her laptop screen with satisfaction.
"We have preliminary identification.
The insects are carrying a bacterial pathogen that's treatable with specific antibiotics.
The good news is that it's not life-threatening with proper treatment.
The bad news is that without treatment, it can cause serious complications."
How soon can we start treating the sick soldiers?
I've already contacted the military pharmacy to rush the appropriate medications here.
They should arrive this afternoon. Most soldiers should begin showing improvement within 24 to 48 hours after starting treatment.
As Margaret continued her work coordinating treatment and containment efforts, she reflected on the strange turns her career had taken. She had never imagined that her expertise in infectious diseases would lead her to a remote military base in Afghanistan, but she had learned long ago that diseases didn't respect borders, politics, or expectations. The investigation had revealed important lessons about supply chain security and the unexpected ways that globalization could create new pathways for disease transmission.
Her report would likely influence military procurement procedures for years to come.
But, for now, her focus remained on the immediate task of healing the soldiers who had trusted her with their lives. As she prepared to begin the treatment phase of her mission, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from solving a medical mystery that had seemed unsolvable just 24 hours earlier. The colonel's initial skepticism had been completely replaced by profound respect and gratitude. As he watched her work with quiet efficiency and unwavering confidence, he realized that sometimes the most powerful weapons in the military arsenal came in unexpected packages. The arrival of the antibiotics marked the beginning of a tense 48-hour period that would test both Margaret's medical expertise and her ability to manage a crisis under extreme pressure. Colonel Mitchell had arranged for a military medical helicopter to deliver the medications, along with additional testing equipment that Margaret had requested from the CDC. As the helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 28 soldiers were depending on her diagnosis being correct, and any mistake could have serious consequences. She had been confident in her preliminary assessment, but medicine always carried an element of uncertainty, especially in field conditions. Dr. Emily Chen, a military infectious disease specialist from the Regional Medical Center, had arrived with the supplies. Margaret was relieved to have a colleague with military medical experience to help manage the treatment phase of the crisis. The two women quickly established a working partnership that combined Margaret's field research expertise with Emily's knowledge of military medical protocols. "Your preliminary analysis is impressive," Emily said as they reviewed the laboratory results together. "The bacterial identification matches perfectly with the symptoms we're seeing." "How did you narrow it down so quickly?" Margaret explained her systematic approach to the investigation, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond obvious explanations. "Most people would have assumed food contamination or water supply issues. The key was recognizing that the infection pattern didn't match those typical vectors." They began administering treatments immediately, starting with the most severe cases. Private Johnson, who had been one of the first soldiers Margaret examined, was also among the sickest. His fever had spiked to dangerous levels overnight, and he was showing signs of dehydration despite intravenous fluid support. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret asked as she checked his vital signs. "Pretty rough, ma'am," Johnson replied weakly. "But everyone's saying you figured out what's wrong with us. That's got to be good news, right?" Margaret smiled reassuringly while noting his improved mental alertness despite the continued fever. "We're starting you on specific treatment today. I expect you'll begin feeling better within the next day or two." As she moved through the medical tent, administering medications and monitoring patient responses, Margaret was acutely aware that Colonel Mitchell was watching her work. The pressure of command was something she understood from her years of leading medical teams during international crisis situations. The colonel was responsible not just for these 6 soldiers, but for the entire base's operational readiness. By late afternoon, some of the soldiers who had received early treatment began showing subtle signs of improvement. Their temperatures started dropping slightly, and several reported that their severe headaches were beginning to ease. Margaret documented every change carefully, building a database that would help optimize treatment for any future cases. However, not all news was positive. 3 soldiers developed complications that suggested their infections had progressed further than initially apparent. Sergeant Martinez, a veteran of 2 previous deployments, developed breathing difficulties that required immediate intervention. "His oxygen saturation is dropping," Emily reported as they worked to stabilize him. "The infection may have spread to his respiratory system." Margaret adjusted his antibiotic dosage and added respiratory support measures. This sometimes happens with delayed treatment. The bacteria can cause inflammation in multiple organ systems before being brought under control. Colonel Mitchell entered the medical tent as they were working on Sergeant Martinez. The sergeant's wife and 2 young children were waiting for him back home in Texas, and Mitchell had personally called to update them on his condition. The weight of that conversation was evident on his face. "How is he doing, doctor?" "He's stable, but this is a critical period. The next 12 hours will tell us whether the treatment is controlling the infection effectively." Margaret worked through the night, monitoring the seriously ill soldiers and adjusting treatment protocols based on their responses. Emily proved to be an invaluable partner, her military medical training complementing Margaret's research background perfectly. Together, they managed what had become essentially a field research study and treatment program simultaneously. By morning, the results were encouraging. Most soldiers showed clear signs of improvement, with temperatures dropping and energy levels beginning to return. Even Sergeant Martinez had stabilized, though he remained on respiratory support as a precaution.
Private Johnson was sitting up in bed, eating solid food for the first time in a week. "Doc, I don't know how to thank you. Yesterday I thought I was dying, and today I feel almost human again."
Margaret felt the familiar rush of satisfaction that came with successful treatment outcomes.
"The credit belongs to modern antibiotics, Private. I just figured out which ones you needed."
Colonel Mitchell approached her as she completed morning rounds. His respect for her abilities had grown steadily over the past 3 days, but something else had changed as well. He had begun to see her not just as a medical consultant, but as a leader who had taken command of an impossible situation and turned it around through sheer competence and determination. "Dr. Thompson, I need to discuss the next phase of this operation with you." They walked to his office, where Margaret was surprised to find several senior officers participating via secure video conference. General Patricia Hayes, the regional commander, had been following the situation closely and wanted to understand the broader implications of the outbreak. "Dr. Thompson," the general began, "your rapid identification and treatment of this infection has prevented what could have been a serious medical crisis. However, we need to understand how this happened and ensure it doesn't happen again." Margaret had been expecting this conversation. The security implications of infected supply shipments were significant, and the military would need to implement new screening procedures to prevent similar incidents.
"General, this appears to have been an unintentional contamination.
The contractor responsible for packing these supplies was using biodegradable materials sourced from a region where these insects are endemic. They probably didn't even realize they were shipping insect larvae along with military equipment.
What changes do we need to make to prevent recurrence?"
Margaret outlined a comprehensive plan that included enhanced inspection protocols for biological materials, mandatory quarantine periods for certain types of shipments, and improved coordination between military medical personnel and infectious disease specialists.
"The most important change is awareness," she emphasized. "Most security screening focuses on obvious threats like weapons or explosives. Biological contamination can be much more subtle and, potentially more dangerous."
General Hayes nodded approvingly. "I'm authorizing you to work with our logistics and security teams to develop new protocols.
This kind of expertise needs to be built into our standard operating procedures."
After the video conference ended, Colonel Mitchell remained in his office with Margaret. The crisis had created an unexpected professional relationship between them, built on mutual respect and shared responsibility for soldier welfare.
"I have a confession to make," Mitchell said.
"When you arrived here, I was hoping the Pentagon would recall you and send someone with military experience instead."
Margaret laughed. "I could tell.
You weren't exactly subtle about your skepticism."
"I was wrong. Completely wrong.
You saved lives here, and you did it using skills that none of us possessed."
"I've learned something important about not judging people by appearances."
"Colonel, I've been dealing with that kind of prejudice my entire career."
"The medical field isn't always welcoming to women, especially older women who don't fit the expected image of authority. But I've found that results speak louder than appearances."
As they discussed the ongoing treatment plan and prevention protocols, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her arrival. The sick soldiers were recovering, the base was implementing new safety measures, and she had gained the complete confidence of the military personnel who had initially doubted her.
Dr. Emily Chan joined them to provide an update on patient conditions.
All soldiers were now showing improvement, and several of the milder cases would likely be released from medical care within another day or two.
Sergeant Martinez had been removed from respiratory support and was talking about wanting to call his wife.
"The success rate has been remarkable," Emily reported.
100% response to treatment, no serious complications, and rapid recovery times.
This case study will be valuable for military medicine training." Margaret appreciated the recognition from her younger colleague, but she was more focused on ensuring complete recovery for all affected personnel.
"We need to continue monitoring for at least another week. Some bacterial infections can have secondary effects that appear after apparent recovery."
Colonel Mitchell authorized extended medical observation for all affected soldiers, despite pressure to return personnel to active duty as quickly as possible.
His confidence in Margaret's medical judgment had grown to the point where he was willing to override standard military efficiency concerns. As evening approached, Margaret walked through the base one more time, observing the return of normal activity levels. Soldiers were moving with purpose and energy, the tension that had permeated the FOB for weeks was dissipating, and operational readiness was being restored. She paused at the storage area where her investigation had begun. The contaminated containers had been properly disposed of, new inspection protocols were in place, and additional screening equipment had been installed. The changes would protect not just this base, but potentially dozens of others that received supplies through similar logistics networks. Captain Rodriguez found her there as the sun was setting over the Afghan landscape. "Doctor, I wanted to thank you again before you leave tomorrow. We were really scared that we were dealing with something we couldn't fight." "Fear of the unknown is natural," Margaret replied. "But, once you understand what you're facing, you can develop strategies to defeat it. That's true whether you're fighting an enemy army or microscopic bacteria." As she prepared for her final night at the base, Margaret completed her official report documenting the entire investigation and treatment process. The report would be distributed throughout the military medical system and would likely influence infection control protocols for years to come. But, beyond the official documentation, she carried with her the satisfaction of having solved a medical mystery that had seemed impossible just a few days earlier. The combination of systematic investigation, scientific analysis, and practical treatment application had once again proven that even the most complex problems could be solved with the right approach. Colonel Mitchell found her in the communications center, finishing her reports and coordinating with CDC officials about follow-up research on the bacterial strain they had identified. "Doctor, I want you to know that I'll be recommending you for official recognition of your service here. What you've accomplished in less than a week is extraordinary." Margaret looked up from her laptop. "Colonel, the recognition I value most is seeing healthy soldiers return to duty. That's reward enough for me. Nevertheless, the military needs to acknowledge expertise wherever we find it. You've shown us that the most effective weapons against some threats come from unexpected sources." As her final night at Forward Operating Base Warrior drew to a close, Margaret felt the quiet satisfaction that came from work well done. Tomorrow she would return to her regular consulting practice, but the lessons learned here would influence both her future work and the military's approach to biological threats. The soldiers were healing, new protection protocols were in place, and a potential medical crisis had been averted through the application of scientific method and medical expertise. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with knowledge, determination, and the willingness to look beyond obvious explanations to find hidden truths. 6 months after her return from Afghanistan, Margaret Thompson was delivering a presentation to a packed auditorium at the Walter Reed Medical Center. Her case study of the FOB warrior outbreak had become required reading in military medical training programs, and her innovations in field investigation techniques were being implemented across all branches of service. The audience included senior military medical officers, CDC researchers, and international health officials who had come to learn from her systematic approach to infectious disease investigation in challenging environments. But, for Margaret, the most meaningful attendees were the 12 soldiers from FOB Warrior who had been granted special leave to attend her presentation. Private Johnson, now Corporal Johnson, sat in the front row with his unit. His recovery had been complete, and he had returned to full active duty within 2 weeks of Margaret's departure from Afghanistan. Sergeant Martinez, whose case had been the most severe, was also present, healthy and recently promoted to staff sergeant. The key to successful field investigation, Margaret explained to her audience, is never accepting the obvious explanation without thorough verification. In combat environments, medical teams often assume that mysterious illnesses must be related to local environmental factors or enemy action. This case demonstrates the importance of considering global supply chain contamination as a potential vector. Colonel Mitchell, now promoted to full colonel, had flown in specifically for the presentation. He served as a co-presenter, offering the military perspective on how Margaret's investigation had changed operational protocols throughout the Afghanistan theater of operations. Dr. Thompson's approach saved not only the lives of my soldiers, but potentially hundreds of other service members, Mitchell told the audience. Her recommendations led to the discovery of contaminated shipments at 6 other forward operating bases before they could cause outbreaks. The new inspection protocols she developed have become standard across all overseas operations. After the formal presentation, Margaret was approached by Dr. Sarah Kim, a representative from the World Health Organization who had been following her work with interest. "Dr. Thompson, we've been impressed by your rapid response capabilities and your innovation in field investigation techniques. The WHO is developing new rapid response teams for international health emergencies. Would you consider leading our infectious disease investigation unit?" Margaret had been expecting this conversation. Her work in Afghanistan had attracted attention from international health organizations, and several prestigious positions had been offered to her in recent months. At 53, she was being presented with opportunities that would crown her career with the kind of recognition most researchers only dreamed of. "I appreciate the offer, Dr. Kim. Can I have some time to consider the implications?" "Of course. We're not looking to fill the position immediately, but your combination of field experience and research expertise makes you our preferred candidate." As the reception continued, Margaret found herself in conversation with young military medical officers who peppered her with questions about field investigation techniques. Their enthusiasm reminded her of her own early career, when each new outbreak had been an exciting puzzle to solve. Captain Lisa Park, a newly commissioned medical officer preparing for deployment to Africa, was particularly interested in practical field techniques. "Dr. Thompson, what advice would you give to someone just starting in military medicine? How do you develop the instincts for investigation that you demonstrated in Afghanistan?" Margaret smiled at the young officer's eagerness. "The most important skill is systematic observation. Don't just look at symptoms, examine the entire environment where patients live and work. Often the crucial clue is something that everyone else considers insignificant." Colonel Mitchell joined their conversation, adding his perspective on the administrative challenges of implementing new medical protocols in military settings. "Dr. Thompson not only solved our immediate problem, but she also had to convince skeptical commanders to implement changes that seemed unnecessary to people who didn't understand the scientific basis for her recommendations." "That's a crucial skill," Margaret agreed. "Scientific knowledge means nothing if you can't communicate its importance to decision-makers who may not have technical backgrounds. You need to translate complex medical concepts into operational language that military leaders can understand and act upon." As the evening progressed, Margaret was introduced to General Patricia Hayes, who had flown in from her new assignment at the Pentagon. The general had been following Margaret's post-Afghanistan career with interest and had a specific purpose for attending the presentation. "Dr. Thompson, I want to discuss a new initiative we're developing at the Department of Defense. We're creating a rapid response medical unit specifically designed to handle unusual health threats in deployed environments. We need someone to design the protocols and training programs for this unit." "What kind of timeline are we discussing, General?" "We'd like to have preliminary protocols developed within 6 months, with full training programs operational within a year. The position would be based here in Washington, but it would involve travel to overseas locations for training and consultation." Margaret considered the offer carefully. It would represent a significant career change, moving her from independent consulting into a formal military advisory role. But it would also give her the opportunity to influence military medical practices on a global scale. "I'd need to maintain some independence to continue my research and consulting work with civilian organizations." "That's not only acceptable, it's desirable. We want someone who stays connected to the broader infectious disease research community. Your civilian perspective is part of what makes your approach so effective." After the reception ended, Margaret walked through the medical center with Private Johnson and several other soldiers from her Afghanistan case. They had requested a private meeting to thank her personally for her work, but Margaret suspected they had additional motives for the conversation. "Dr. Thompson," Johnson began, "we wanted you to know how much your work has meant to all of us. But we also wanted to ask you something." "What is it, Corporal?" Sergeant Martinez stepped forward. "We've all been following your career since Afghanistan, and we know you're being offered some prestigious positions. We just wanted to make sure you know that what you did for us wasn't just about solving a medical puzzle. You showed us that someone cared enough to fight for answers when everyone else had given up hope. Margaret felt unexpected emotion at the young soldier's words. Throughout her career, she had focused on the scientific challenges of disease investigation, sometimes losing sight of the human impact of her work. These soldiers were reminding her that behind every case study were real people whose lives had been affected by her decisions. Your recovery and return to service is the most meaningful recognition I could receive, she replied. Knowing that you're all healthy and continuing your service is worth more than any award or position. Staff Sergeant Martinez nodded. We also wanted you to know that we've all been encouraging other soldiers to consider medical career fields. Your example has shown us that medical professionals are just as important as combat soldiers in keeping units operational and effective. As they parted company, Margaret realized that her work in Afghanistan had created ripple effects she had never anticipated. Not only had it influenced military medical protocols, but it had also inspired young soldiers to consider medical careers, potentially creating a new generation of military health professionals. The next morning, Margaret met with Colonel Mitchell for breakfast before his return flight to his new assignment. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience in crisis management. Have you decided about the Pentagon position? He asked. I'm leaning toward accepting it. The opportunity to influence military medical practices globally is appealing, and I think I could make a significant contribution to service member health and safety. Mitchell nodded approvingly. I think it's the right choice. Your Afghanistan work demonstrated that civilian medical expertise can be crucial to military effectiveness. Having you in a formal advisory role would give commanders access to capabilities they might not otherwise consider. There's one condition I want to negotiate. I want to ensure that any protocols we develop include specific provisions for collaboration with civilian medical researchers. Military medicine can't operate in isolation from the broader scientific community. That makes perfect sense. Some of our most serious health threats don't respect the boundaries between military and civilian populations. As they discussed the potential scope of Margaret's new role, both reflected on how much their perspectives had changed since their first meeting in the Afghan desert. Mitchell had learned to value expertise regardless of its source, while Margaret had gained appreciation for the unique challenges of military medical practice. I have to admit, Mitchell said, when I first saw you step off that truck, I thought you looked more like someone's grandmother than a disease expert. Margaret laughed. I probably did look more like a grandmother than a military consultant. But that's been an advantage throughout my career. People underestimate me, which often gives me more access and cooperation than I might get otherwise. Well, nobody who works with you will make that mistake again. Your reputation in military medical circles is now legendary. 2 weeks later, Margaret accepted the Pentagon position, beginning a new phase of her career that would take her around the world implementing the lessons learned from the FOB warrior outbreak. Her first assignment was developing rapid response protocols for medical teams deploying to Africa, where emerging infectious diseases posed constant threats to military operations. As she prepared for this new challenge, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns her career had taken. She had started as a traditional research scientist, moved into field investigation work, and now found herself designing medical protocols for global military operations. Each phase had built on the previous one, creating expertise that no single educational program could have provided. The phone call that had sent her to Afghanistan had seemed like a routine consultation assignment at the time. But it had become the defining case of her career, demonstrating that expertise and determination could solve problems that seemed impossible. More importantly, it had shown her that the most meaningful work often came from unexpected opportunities. Margaret's final task before leaving for her Pentagon orientation was completing a comprehensive case study of the FOB warrior investigation for publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. The article would serve as both a medical reference and a training tool for future generations of military medical officers. As she wrote the conclusion of her article, Margaret summarized the broader lessons of the case. Effective medical investigation requires systematic observation, willingness to challenge conventional assumptions, and the confidence to pursue evidence wherever it leads. In military environments, these principles are complicated by operational pressures and security considerations,
but they remain fundamental to successful disease control. The article's final paragraph reflected on the human dimension of medical practice. Behind every disease outbreak are individuals whose lives and careers depend on accurate diagnosis and effective treatment. The responsibility to provide the best possible medical care transcends institutional boundaries and professional prejudices. Sometimes the most important medical equipment is an open mind and the determination to keep searching for answers when easy explanations prove inadequate. 6 months later, Dr. Margaret Thompson was standing in another military facility, this time training a new generation of rapid response medical teams. The protocols she had developed were being tested in simulated outbreak scenarios, preparing military medical officers to handle the kind of complex investigation that had made her reputation. Among her students was Captain Lisa Park, the young officer she had met at Walter Reed, now preparing for deployment to a medical unit in East Africa. The captain had requested assignment to Margaret's training program, inspired by the Afghanistan case study that had become legendary in military medical education. Dr. Thompson, Captain Park said after a particularly challenging simulation exercise, "I hope I can handle a real outbreak with half the skill you demonstrated in Afghanistan." Margaret smiled at the young officer's earnestness. "Captain, the most important thing I can teach you is that there's no substitute for careful observation and systematic analysis. The specific techniques can be learned, but the mindset of never accepting easy answers has to become instinctive." As she watched the new medical officers practice the investigation techniques that had become standard military protocol, Margaret felt deep satisfaction in knowing that her work was creating lasting change in how the military approached infectious disease threats. The lessons learned from 28 sick soldiers in a remote Afghan base were now protecting service members around the world. The colonel who had once scoffed at her appearance now frequently cited her work in his own training presentations. Their partnership had become a case study in effective civilian-military cooperation, demonstrating that expertise and results mattered more than appearances or conventional expectations. Margaret's reputation had evolved from that of a competent consultant to a pioneering expert who had revolutionized military approaches to infectious disease investigation. But, for her, the most meaningful measure of success remained the simple fact that soldiers like Corporal Johnson and Staff Sergeant Martinez had returned to healthy, productive service. As she prepared her students for their upcoming deployments, Margaret reflected that sometimes the most important victories were won not through dramatic action, but through patient analysis, systematic investigation, and the quiet determination to find truth in the face of uncertainty. The coat she had removed that first day in Afghanistan had concealed not weapons or rank insignia, but the tools and expertise of a life dedicated to fighting invisible enemies that threatened human health and safety.